between 1939 and 1945, more than 70 million lives were extinguished. Imagine half the people in California vanishing in 6 years, city grids dimming, classrooms emptying, dinner tables set for those who never come home. A continent's worth of names reduced to folded letters and quiet doorways. The most advanced machines ever built turned to ash and wind. The oldest instincts, fear, hunger, loyalty, decided the fate of empires. This wasn't just a war of tanks and maps. It was a long unraveling of ordinary days. Your grandparents or great-grandparents lived in a world where daily survival depended on choices made oceans away. News moved at the speed of radio, then rumor, then the knock at the door. Gasoline was rationed, sugar was measured. The future was counted in stamps and telegrams, a factory whistle in Detroit, a convoy slipping through black Atlantic swells, a lighthouse on the Pacific coast dimmed against submarine silhouettes. Each small routine braided into a global tension you could feel in your chest. If you've ever held a family photograph from the 1940s and wondered about the solemn eyes and careful posture, know this: they were posing in a storm. Tonight, we'll journey through the rise and fall of the deadliest war in human history, not with explosions, but with quiet footsteps through time. We'll walk beside the decisions made in offices thick with smoke and the decisions made in kitchens lit by a single bulb. We'll listen for the faint hinge of moments. Treaties signed at midnight, code names whispered over static, a train leaving 1 minute late, and the way those hinges swung the world open to catastrophe and eventually to a different kind of morning. Let us step softly into 1939, a world on the edge of fire, radio dials glowing amber, newspapers rustling like dry leaves, borders drawn as if by a trembling hand, and trace, with steady breath and patient light, how the ordinary became the unthinkable. In the late summer of 1939, Europe smells of ink and damp wool. Newspapers slide from presses in long, warm ribbons, fresh pages breathing out a metallic scent of type and oil. Vendors stack them in neat towers that wobble on street corners, bold headlines smearing onto a thumb, a sleeve, the edge of a briefcase. The air is cool enough to carry sound cleanly. It lifts the evening bells of Warsaw and hangs them over the rooftops like thin silver threads. People pause at windows, listening. The chime is familiar, but something in its tail feels a shade longer, a touch heavier, as if the bronze itself is worried. In apartments lit by soft bulbs, radios glow with a small, amber certainty. The dial is a geography of names: Paris, Vienna, London, Rome. A hand turns the knurled knob, seeking a voice without static, a sentence without rumor. News arrives as a tide. First a whisper, then a wave, then a hush between announcements in which you can hear your own breath. Families lean toward the cloth-covered speaker, the fabric grid warmed by a patient current. An announcer clears his throat. Somewhere, a pencil hovers over a grocery list, waiting to know whether to add sugar or to cross it out. On Berlin's narrow streets, cafes hold the evening close. Doors open and release a mixture of roasted coffee, tobacco, wet coats, and the faint tang of coal smoke. Tables crowd one another. Chairs scrape. Porcelain clicks softly against saucers. Conversation swings in arcs that look like any other night. A complaint about the weather, a joke about the trains, a half-whispered speculation about a cousin who hasn't sent a letter. The radio behind the counter murmurs beneath the clatter like a second conscience. Waiters weave through the crush with trays held high. the brass hinge of the door breathing out a tired sigh with each pass. In London, student hostels hold their own weather. Stairwells smell of soap, dust, and chalk ground into the wood by hundreds of feet. Hallways glow with low lamps. Posters for lectures and concerts pull at their corners, barely holding to the paint. Someone practices a cello in a dim room where the window rattles to the bow's long strokes. Someone else copies verbs from a notebook, drifts toward a map, traces a coastline with an index finger as if that act alone could smooth it. The kettle complains. A voice calls out, "Does anyone want tea?" The question sounds like ordinary kindness, and it is, though it arrives wrapped in a gathering hush. In Prague, the stones themselves seem to remember. Old squares hold the day's heat and release it slowly into the night, so that shoes, when they cross, feel a faint warmth underfoot. Street lamps polish the cobbles into sequins. The Vltava slides past with a subdued confidence, black and reflective, as if keeping secrets for the city. Footsteps, when they echo under arches, carry a crisp edge that belongs to autumn and the old habit of listening. A pair of officers passes, boots hard against the ground. Their shadows climb and break across the carved facades, a quick geometry of power sketching itself, where saints and saints' stories once held all the height. Beyond the cities, fields ripple to the horizon in patient gold. Poland's late summer wheat shivers as evening finds it, each stem a small metronome in a gentle wind. Farmhouses tuck into the folds of their own shadows. A horse stamps in a wooden stall. A dog lifts its head and then lowers it again. The country smells of cut hay, oiled leather, and the bright green bite of crushed stems. Somewhere a threshing machine rests with a blanket thrown over its engine like a sleeping beast. Somewhere a child counts fireflies. The quiet between tree lines holds the kind of stillness that invites you to lean in, and then reminds you not to lean too far. At rail stations, the atmosphere tastes of iron. The platform's boards tremble with the approach of a train before any lamp burns in the tunnel's throat. Suitcases thump in a rhythm of arrivals and departures that is older than politics. The music of families adjusting. A guard tests the whistle between two fingers, considers, pockets it. Overhead, timetables shuffle minute by minute, an orderly ballet of numbers hiding the human rustle beneath. You can smell hot metal, hear the slow, patient clank of coupling hooks, feel the faint greased grit that clings to a handrail. Mundane textures, holding their place like stagehands while the play changes. Factories wear the evening like a shawl. Windows tremble with the steady thrum of machines. Belts purr, wheels hiss, a flywheel breathes in circles. The work is practical, unromantic, full of small fidelities. A bolt tightened, a gauge checked, a crease ironed into a uniform sleeve. On a bench, someone lays out tools in a straight line as if honesty could be arranged with a ruler. On a wall, a calendar tries to make days behave. The oil on the floor catches light and returns it as a smear, gold bent into gray. Over all of it, there's the soft percussion of human industry, a lullaby with a metallic beat. And yet, in alleyways, in the extra glance at a stranger's armband, in the way voices dip when the door opens, there is a second layer of air. Trains do not simply connect, they concentrate. Borders do not just separate, they sharpen. The last draft from a beer glass is swallowed with an almost ceremonial care, as if the bottom might hold an omen. A baker wakes earlier than usual, though nothing in the sky suggests urgency. A policeman adjusts his cap a fraction lower. People feel the world pivot a few degrees and pretend, with a studied gentleness, that it hasn't. Across the continent, radios thread these places together. The same sentence lands in Warsaw kitchens and Paris salons, in Berlin cafes and London dormitories, the way a light rain advances across fields, first tapping one roof, then the next. On coasts, the sea speaks in its own grammar. A hush, a swell, a distant bell. Fishing nets come up heavy or light, indifferent to proclamations. Lighthouses write their patient punctuation across the horizon. Ships tip their shoulders to the waves and continue. Metal gathers in depots, quiet as held breath. German tanks wait under tarps that smell of canvas and new paint. Their plates are cold to the touch, edges crisp, the teeth of their tracks clean like a freshly sharpened saw. Maintenance crews move around them with the slow certainty of ritual. Fuel checked, oil topped, bolts tested with a practiced wrist. The machines look asleep, but it is the sleep of intention. In courtyards, bicycles lean in pairs, and for a second the world looks normal. 2 circles, 2 circles, until you catch the helmets hanging above them like punctuation marks. Even the sky seems to prepare. Night falls earlier at this latitude. Dusk lingers as a diluted blue that admits, reluctantly, the first stars. Clouds gather in long, ironed bands, advancing without hurry. The moon bleaches the edges of uniforms and laundry alike, making no distinctions. In that light, faces look carved, details softened, worries rearranged into calm. Not peace. Calm. The kind that arrives when you've said everything you can say, and the hour insists on silence. Stand here a moment, in this braided hush. Ink and bells, steam and wool, amber radio dials, and the black river's slow shoulder. Feel how the ordinary holds its ground. Doors latch. Windows close with a sensible click. Dogs settle. The last cafe table is wiped in a smooth oval. A tram hums along its route, sparks licking the wire in quick, bright kisses. All the small tasks finish themselves. The continent breathes in, gently, and keeps the breath. On the edge of the stillness, history waits. Polite at first, hands folded, eyes on the floor. Soon, it will clear its throat. Soon, the sentence that everyone half hears will complete itself. For now, the weight of the coming days rests in the texture of things. The cool gloss of a tram rail, the faint soot on a windowsill, the taste of metal in the station air, the gold of the fields bending. And when the bells ring again, they will ring the same notes as always, only different, only heavier, only true. In September, the chalk dust in room 4 settled the way snow settles, softly, as if each speck had chosen its place. Merrick kept a small tin of chalk on his desk, a battered box with a hinge that squeaked. He liked the neatness of it, white sticks arranged like candles in a shrine to order. Outside, Warsaw's sky held a hard blue brightness. Inside, a map of Europe curled at the corners as though it had been left too close to a stove. 23 students faced him, the oldest 13, the youngest 8, their elbows shiny from scarcity and their eyes quick with the impatience of the young. He had taught them that rivers have sources and mouths, that verbs have tenses, that the world has seasons and the seasons come back. On the last peaceful morning, he drew a diagonal across the board and wrote cause on one side, effect on the other, the words like 2 docks on opposite banks. Bridges, he said, tapping the chalk, are what we build between them. Sometimes with reason, sometimes with luck, A boy in the front row traced the word effect in the air with his finger. A girl in the second row whispered the spelling under her breath. A quiet hum joined to the low rattle of the streetcar outside. Somewhere, a church bell counted the hour in dignified tones. Merrick nodded, satisfied by small progress. He believed in the arithmetic of patience. Today's understanding added to tomorrow's would become a life. By the third day of September, the bell's tone had changed, as if metal could worry. News ran down the streets faster than people did. It slid under doors, tucked itself into pockets, rode home on the sleeve of anyone who'd happened to pass a kiosk. Sirens arrived like the sudden hiss of a match, and then the sound larger than thought. Aircraft pressing the night down. Windows shook, as if the city had caught a fever. Merrick counted heartbeats between explosions, an old sailor's trick for weather, though he had never been to sea. The class thinned by halves. An empty desk at the back, then two, then a cluster where the small ones used to sit shoulder to shoulder. He wrote the date carefully at the top corner of the board each morning, as though recording it would make it obey. On the 5th, Zofia did not come. On the 6th, neither did Jozek. On the 7th, the janitor handed him a note from a mother. The children are with their aunt near Woolwich. Marek folded it and placed it under the tin of chalk, as if weight could save anything from wind. He turned lessons into islands. Geography became the study of shelter. Great rivers as corridors of escape, mountain passes as gates that could open or close. Arithmetic became rationing, how to divide bread to last a week, how to turn the stubborn calendar into meals. Language became the discipline of letters, what words you could write and what words would not cross the censor's threshold. He gave homework that could be done in cellars. He taught the older ones to copy quickly, not because he feared losing light, but because he feared losing the day itself. One afternoon, a plane passed so low over the roof that dust leapt from the rafters. He felt it on his tongue. Plaster, old wood, the taste of age. He continued in a voice that was almost conversational, as if the sound outside were a neighbor dragging a chair. "What is a sentence?" he asked. And when no one answered, he said, "It is a thought that finds an ending." He almost smiled at his own foolishness. By the second week, there were 6 students. They sat close to the stove and took turns serving lessons back to him, as though learning could be kept alive the way a fire is kept alive, with breath. He began to carry a small notebook in his coat. On one page, he wrote the names of those who had stopped coming. On the facing page, he wrote what each had loved. Zofia, wildflowers pressed in a dictionary. Jozek, the neatness of multiplication. Anton, drawing horses in the margins. He believed that keeping both lists together made a bridge. A shell struck somewhere beyond the next block. The room jerked, and a small crack, like a hair left by a comb, appeared along the ceiling. There was an impossible quiet afterwards, a stillness that made the ticking clock sound guilty. Marek stepped to the window. On Świętojerska Street, people moved with the speed that isn't speed at all, purposeful but careful, as if actions had acquired a new gravity. A woman gathered eggs that had rolled from a broken basket. A man held a door for 3 strangers and nodded at each as they passed. A dog, confused by all the new rules, barked at its own echo. He returned to the chalkboard and wrote a single word. After, he underlined it, then underlined it again. "Whatever else we say," he told the 6, "there will be an after." We may not choose its shape, but we can choose what we carry into it. He showed them how to fold a page so that it would open to the most important part. He showed them how to memorize by rhythm, turning facts into a hum that could survive the dark. When the siren rose again, he did not raise his voice. He lowered it, and they leaned in to catch each syllable. And in that leaning, all 7 of them belonged to the same breath. On the morning the doors were forced and strangers measured the room with new eyes, the tin of chalk sat in its usual place. A soldier lifted the lid, considered the sticks, and replaced it as if he'd touched something domestic by mistake. Marek stood straight, not out of courage, but out of an old habit of posture. He watched his students being led away in groups toward home, or what was left of it, assignments undone, pencils still warm from their fingers. By afternoon, the room was a square of sunlight, paling on a floor where small feet had memorized a path between desks and stove. He wrote the date one last time. It looked like an argument with the wall. He carried the notebook with the 2 lists to the river at dusk and read the names aloud, carefully, like prayers that didn't presume an answer. Then he wrote one more on the page of loves and closed the book. His own. The sound of a class settling, the way chalk breaks, gentle. He slipped the notebook inside his jacket, as if to add a layer of warmth where fear had taken one away. He walked back up Świętojerska Street under a sky turning iron, thinking the smallest thought he could hold. Tomorrow, if there is one, I will teach wherever the light is. Second, the nurse of distant sirens. Across the water and a little further in time, Ruth arrived in England with a suitcase that had given up on dignity. Its lock clicked like an old man's knee. She was from Cleveland, a city that smelled of lake wind and steel, and the first English air she breathed tasted faintly of coal and rain. The hospital in which she worked was a building of layers, brick upon brick, corridor upon corridor, a place that had learned to swallow sound. She tied her hair under a cap and pinned a watch to her dress, a small circle that made time behave in polite increments. On Ruth's second night, the sirens walked up from the river and into the wards. The sound poured through the windows like cold. Nurses moved with that curious speed that isn't a rush. Hands precise, steps exact, voices low as wool. She learned the grammar of blackout, how to coax a curtain to meet its frame, how to cradle a lamp so that light stayed a private matter. She learned the taste of adrenaline as surely as she had learned the taste of aspirin years before, that chalky insistence. The building took a breath, held it. Somewhere deep in the city, something struck, and someone paused, and the next moment began. Letters found her like birds finding a sill. Her mother's careful loops, her father's brief, "We are proud," her sister's enclosures of gossip and recipes, and the small, sunlit disasters of home. She kept the envelopes in a tin she had bought from a charity shop, a tin that had once held biscuits and now held the idea of continuity. She read them in the 10 minutes between one task and the next, the prose restoring a corridor to a sidewalk, a trolley to a streetcar, the kettle to the kitchen it belonged to. She answered when she could, printing in a disciplined hand, "I sleep enough. The food is fine. Everyone here is very brave. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the whole thing. On nights when the sirens didn't come, the hospital made its own weather. Someone had always just made tea. Someone had always just spilled it. A patient coughed in polite staccato and apologized to the ceiling. A porter whistled something tuneless, but determined. Ruth timed her steps along the hallway so the floorboards wouldn't complain. The watch at her breast was a metronome. Her hands learned choreography. Lift, fold, smooth, measure, pour, count. In quiet hours, she could almost locate a soft seam in the world where the ordinary continued to breathe under the weight of the extraordinary. During the first raid that found them, the lights went down like a curtain. The ward became shapes and breath. Ruth's fingers found the bridge of a nose, the angle of a cheekbone, gauze by texture, tape by its stubborn little tear. She spoke in sentences that had no edges. There we are, good, nearly. The words more temperature than meaning. Somewhere a window buckled, then held. Dust floated through the beam of a nurse's shaded torch, like a patient snow. When the all clear finally climbed the clock and rang through the corridors, it sounded almost embarrassed by its own relief. Each morning, the city wore a new arrangement of gaps and rubble and stubborn shop windows. People stepped around crater edges with a careful courtesy, as if each hole in the street belonged to everyone. Laundry flapped from lines where walls were open to the weather, a modest insistence. Ruth walked to the bus beneath a sky that had learned too much. In her pocket, a letter from home warmed against her palm. In her other pocket, she kept a pencil worn short, the wood smooth as bone. She had a ritual now, a second of stillness before the hospital doors, a count of 4, and then in. With time, names turned into stories, and stories into a village. Mrs. Haddock in bed 4, humming hymns she didn't believe in. Tom in bed 12, who disliked milk but accepted it as medicine. The doctor, with sleeves always rolled, as if the body's suffering could be negotiated if only one were ready. Ruth's American vowels softened at the edges, her yes acquiring a British curve, her no learning to apologize without surrender. At night, when the sirens were only a rumor, she would sit by the window for a minute and watch the neighbor's cat patrol the blacked-out yard, a small, sensible creature attending to the boarders. On a clear afternoon, a letter arrived that had been sent months before. The envelope had traveled by way of opened and resealed. The postscript, a rambling of stamps and official initials. Her father told her a story about a neighbor's victory garden, the tomatoes stubborn as saints. Her mother sent a recipe for corn pudding and underlined bake until set. Her sister enclosed a photograph of children on a swing in a park Ruth knew well, the chains a blur, the long hair of the girl a flag of domestic freedom. She pressed her thumb to the faces as if she might steady them through the paper. Write when you can. The letter ended. We keep your chair at the table. That night, the sirens came in a cruel key. The sky stuttered like a failing engine. The earth answered with its own deep vowels. Ruth's body knew what to do. Measure, fold, lift, count. Someone called her name and she was there. A colleague's hand found hers and squeezed once. The measured exchange of bravery. Hours later, days, the all clear came again, thinner now. In the morning, the street had lost 2 houses and discovered a view of a garden that had not consented to be seen. A bird sang in a stunned way from a ruptured tree. People tidied. It was what they had. Ruth wrote home. We persist. 3 words, a doctrine. She added, I have learned to hear the difference between the beginning of a siren and the beginning of a kettle. The kettle is kinder. She sealed the envelope and started her rounds. The watch ticked in a voice she trusted. She did not count the nights. She counted the hands she held that softened their grip before sleep. The safe kind, the ordinary kind, the one the ward could give back. 3. The soldier who counted cranes. In Manchuria, winter came down like a certainty, and spring negotiated inch by inch. Hiroshi had grown up near Nagoya, where summers were heavy, and cicadas rehearsed the sound of persistence. He had volunteered, or he had been carried by the tide, the distinction blurred in his memory like a shoreline at dusk. He wore a uniform that fit as if it had been made for someone with broader shoulders. He kept a paper crane in his breast pocket, folded by his sister the night before he left, its wings flattened by months of movement until it felt like a second skin. His unit's outpost was a geometry of necessity. Timber huts arranged in a sense-making grid, a stove for heat, a rack for rifles, an axis of routine pinned through each day. Snow made statements at night and then reconsidered them by noon. The ground held the memory of trains. Vibrations traveled for miles and arrived underfoot the way thunder does. Hiroshi's work was practical. Count crates, check oil, listen to the engine's language for hints of trouble. He wrote lists with the care of a bookkeeper. Bullets, blankets, lengths of rope, the numbers like beads aligned. At first, duty felt like a clear road laid across his map of the world. Then came the days that tangled. He did what he was told, escorted shipments, guarded rail lines, nodded at orders expressed as if no one in the sentence had a pronoun. Once he stood at the edge of a village as smoke rose, and he understood how the word secure could mean silent, and how quickly silence could turn to ash. He carved small animals from scrap wood and gave them to children who watched him with both fear and a curiosity too large for their faces. A little boy lifted a dragon, inspected the curve of its back with a craftsman's attention, and bowed in a gesture that felt older than any uniform. Later, Hiroshi scrubbed his hands until the skin flamed and then calmed and could not bring them entirely clean. At night, he counted cranes, the paper one in his pocket and the tall living ones that visited the field at the limit of patrol. They came on long legs that wrote careful sentences in the mud. He admired their diplomacy, the way they negotiated wind and water with a patience impossible for people. He unbuttoned his coat enough to breathe and stitched his thoughts together with thin thread, promising himself he would not pull too hard, promising he would leave the knot alone. The promise didn't hold. He began to keep a notebook. On one side, he wrote the facts of the day. On the other, he wrote the smallest things. Saw 3 cranes. Heard 2 frogs. Smelled pine smoke. Remembered the sound of father's planes in summer. The dual entries balanced each other like a scale with a coin on each dish. He didn't speak against orders. He learned to speak around them. He deferred to sergeants, to lieutenants, to the inevitable. He delayed a fire when a hut was empty, delayed an advance by a minute so a dog could run clear of the road, delayed a search long enough for a grandmother to retrieve a photograph. Small treasons, he thought, a fisherman's adjustment to the current rather than a captain's revolt. He slept lightly and woke feeling as if he had slept underwater. Rest had come, but at cost. On a morning that looked like any other, he crossed the depot yard and saw a reflection of himself in the canteen window. Cap straight, boots clean, jaw set in the borrowed handwriting of discipline. He almost didn't recognize the way his face had become a mask for a younger face behind it. He wrote to his sister without writing what most needed saying. He asked about the persimmons in their courtyard, about the neighbor's dog that had once bitten his ankle and then looked apologetic. He told her about the cranes and pretended that the word alone could carry the peace of them across the sea. Once, In a gap of days when nothing demanded anything, he met a farmer repairing a fence. The man did not look at him long. He studied the fence, then the horizon, decided nothing had changed, and passed Hiroshi a nail with a kind of ordinary generosity that felt like a blessing. They worked in parallel, the hammer's rhythm regular as a pulse. Hiroshi realized how long it had been since he had done anything that fit cleanly in the hand. When they were done, the farmer nodded and returned to his field. Hiroshi stood a moment with his palms open, the way one does after carrying something heavy. The cranes returned. He counted them like prayers he wasn't sure how to say. He promised to keep his hands careful, to let the smaller kindnesses survive the larger instructions. He wondered if that was enough. And then, not knowing how to answer, he took an extra shift that allowed a younger man an extra hour of sleep. That night, he dreamed of home, the smell of rice steaming, his mother rinsing teacups at the sink, the radio muttering in the corner as if reciting a familiar poem. He woke to frost stiffening the window, and a dawn so pale it felt almost merciful. When orders shifted and the map outgrew the table, he adjusted his straps and followed. He held the paper crane between thumb and forefinger and felt its tired creases. He pictured his sister's face, stern in its love as she folded it, and told himself that the bird, once unfolded, could become a square again. He knew how paper worked. He also knew that the square would carry the memory of wings. Marek in Warsaw, Ruth in England, Hiroshi in Manchuria. 3 lives threaded through a loom none of them chose. Fear taught them new grammar, how to speak softly and be heard, how to keep a list that balanced cause with effect. Duty wore a dozen uniforms and asked 100 different favors. Sometimes it asked for the smallest coin. Sometimes it brought an invoice too large to hold. Faith in change found modest shapes. A classroom kept alive in a cellar, a steady hand on a pulse during sirens, a delay measured in the time it takes for a grandmother to retrieve a photograph. They were not heroes in the way posters promised. They were custodians of ordinary decency under extraordinary weather. In their pockets, chalk dust, a tin of letters, a tired paper bird. In their mouths, the taste of smoke, of tea, of winter air. Around them, engines, bells, boots, wheels, sea. Above them, skies learning new languages. Beneath them, the ground, which kept doing its old, reliable work of holding. And in each of them, the same quiet vow, made without ceremony. Carry what can be carried. Protect what can be protected. Leave a little light where night has grown crowded. In the first week of September, schedules still tried to pretend the world was tidy. Trams in Warsaw rattled along their rails. Bakeries opened at 5. School bells rang, and then the pattern tore. Poland was not conquered in one moment, but in a series of moments that stacked like plates. The first columns crossing at dawn. The first roofs punched open by bombs. The first refugees walking the verges of roads with blankets folded over their arms like misplaced seasons. The map did not bleed at the edges so much as it was erased in straight, confident strokes. In the west, gray-green uniforms. In the east, a second army arriving with a different certainty. Between them, families became caravans of careful silence. Society learned new verbs quickly. To hide, to cue, to hush. Teachers burned lists. Priests hid records. Shopkeepers portioned sugar into smaller and smaller cones of paper. A city learns occupation one rule at a time. Curfews, papers, ration cards, the new way to answer a question while keeping a piece of yourself unspoken. Yet even here the ordinary insisted on showing up. wedding rings turned on anxious thumbs, a violin tuned in a stairwell, a child tracing a rectangle in dust and calling it a house. The change was not just military, it was domestic. Bedrooms turned into storage for secrets, kitchens turned into councils. The false quiet in the West. Across the border, Paris and London tried on composure. Newspapers spoke in a formal register. Men in hats read them with a practiced squint. Cafes still served their afternoon arguments with coffee and a sugar cube if you could find one. Historians would later call it the phony war. But there was nothing phony about the knitting of socks, the building of shelters, the growing habit of glancing up when a motorcar backfired. Armies faced one another across the Maginot Line like chess players who had agreed to think for a very long time. Civilians cultivated normalcy with the dedication of monks. Office hours observed, windows taped, the radio's calm voices trimmed of adjectives. Children learned to recognize silhouettes, the outline of a friendly fighter, the heavier wing of a bomber. Gas masks were issued and became ungainly companions, stacked in classrooms, boxed under beds, the rubber smell a new kind of domestic musk. Posters asked for patience, for scrap metal, for quiet confidence. If you listened at night in these cities, you could hear the slow rehearsal of a continent teaching itself both restraint and readiness. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the holding of breath before a dive. The development, France falls. In May 1940, the waiting fractured. The invasion came through forests and over rivers that had been thought to offer their own natural veto. It did not. Roads filled with a human river flowing west, mattresses strapped to car roofs, bicycle wheels wobbling under sacks of flour, geese protesting their relocation. The state collapsed the way a shelf collapses. First a tremor, then an unmanageable cascade. Paris tried to be dignified in retreat, closing its shutters like eyelids. Some left with suitcases, others with just a coat, and the notion that home could be something carried in the chest. On beaches farther north, columns of men lined the water as if waiting for a miracle with their boots in the surf. The miracle arrived in catalog colors: trawlers, tugboats, paddle steamers, yachts, lifeboats, civilian craft bumping against war, making rescue their job and doing it stubbornly. Behind them, factories changed their prayers. More parts, more speed, more nights without sleep. The fall of France was a political collapse, yes, but also a social one. Sudden distances between neighbors, new registers of suspicion, the invention of a vocabulary no one had wanted to learn, collaboration, resistance, ration book arithmetic, the price of a whisper. The battle for Britain. Then the sky took its turn. From late summer into autumn, the air above Britain became a grammar of contrails and engine notes. Fighters streaked like punctuation across the blue. Bombers droned in long, ominous sentences. People learned the sequence of siren and shelter, the ritual of the thermos and the blanket and the dog tucked under the bench. The nation's nightscape changed, blackout curtains turning streets into a careful shadow play. The Blitz did not make everyone brave. It made them habitual. Courage became a pattern. Close the shop, check on the neighbor, carry the pail, sweep the glass, queue for tea, sleep if you can. Children were lifted onto trains and buses, and then onto more trains that sighed into the countryside. Labels pinned to coats, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, eyes trying to be older than they were. In unfamiliar kitchens, they learned new accents and the smell of different jam. In cities, fire watchers climbed rooftops. Wardens called, "Put that light out," with the crisp authority of people protecting a shared night. Underground stations became burrows of their own, blankets laid edge to edge, lullabies trading with the rattle of passing trains. Up above, incendiaries fell like bitter rain. Down below, a girl sounded out the next chapter by torchlight. The Soviet Union enters the war. In June 1941, the front tore open again, this time for thousands of miles. Villages along dusty roads woke to columns of tanks that seemed to move with the inevitability of weather. The Eastern War was a geography of endurance, summers of heat that baked the roads into cracked plates, winters that hardened water into stone and men into silhouettes. Cities like Leningrad, ringed and starved, learned a new arithmetic. Calories counted like coins, a birthday celebrated with the last spoon of jam saved since autumn, a piano tuned to silence because strings would not waste energy. Within apartments, families organized life into careful zones, one corner for sleep, one for soup, one for hope. Between those corners, people walked like engineers who have memorized the fault lines of a bridge. Factories moved east like migrating animals. Machines were dismantled, shipped, reassembled, and brought to life under roofs still open to the weather. Teenagers became machinists. Grandmothers became stokers. Songs became work. On trains, wounded men and new soldiers passed in opposite directions, glimpsing each other through windows with that brief, stunned human recognition. We are two halves of the same sentence. The scale defies a single room's comprehension, but the room is where its meaning landed, at a table where someone divided bread into 5 equal parts and gave the crust to the eldest, because that is what had always been done. The global dimension? North Africa, Rommel, and the Desert War. Far from the forests and factories, the desert conducted its own campaign under a sun that judged everyone equally. Here, the front line wandered like a careless pencil stroke, west to east, east to west, measured in miles of sand, and the distance between one oasis and the next. Tanks struggled not with mud, but with heat. Engines were fed with careful hands. Water was a logistics problem first, and a sacrament second. Soldiers learned the physics of mirage and the etiquette of dust, the way it insists on joining every conversation, softening edges, turning men into moving statues. News in the desert arrived as whispers delivered by wind and radio. Names became coordinates: Tobruk, Gazala, El Alamein. Rommel's reputation traveled ahead of him like a standard. So did the patience of the men whose job it was to stop him. At night, constellations stepped down to meet the campfires, and maps were spread on the hoods of vehicles still pinging with heat. Letters home referred to scorpions as calmly as to rations. A joke could travel down a line of foxholes faster than an order. In the mornings, the light rose too clearly on everything. On the practical industriousness of repair, on the courage that looks like boredom until it suddenly doesn't, on the long rows of cans and crates and hopes arranged in straight lines. The Pacific, Pearl Harbor, and Midway. Across the world, a Sunday morning in Hawaii began with laundry and plans, with breakfast plates and the smell of coffee, and then the sky revised the day. The attack on Pearl Harbor translated American domestic life into war in minutes. A radio shouting where a recipe had been. A calendar suddenly important for reasons beyond dentist appointments and paydays. Within hours, factories that had once woven cotton now wove parachute silk. Assembly lines that had stamped cars began to stamp wings. The idea of distance shrank until the Pacific was a room you could cross in a single night of worry. At sea, the war became a contest of eyesight and chance, of code and weather. At Midway, aircraft rose from decks the length of suburban streets, carrying both fuel and hope in dangerous measures. The ocean below looked indifferent, a great ledger balancing losses and rescues. Sailors learned the names of islands they would never visit, atolls reduced to coordinates and airstrips. Back home, kitchen windows accumulated blue stars and sometimes gold ones. Mothers kept telegrams in drawers they seldom opened. In West Coast cities, blackout shades learned the same work as they did in London, and the distant thud of surf became, for some, a metronome for worry. Social images families under bombs. There is a kind of domestic heroism that never makes statues. The kettle filled before the siren, the blanket folded on the chair by the door, the hand that reaches for another hand before the steps to the shelter. Families improvised resilience from simple things. A suitcase was kept packed with documents and a deck of cards. A doll was given a new name because the old one belonged to the street that no longer had houses. A grandfather taught a child to count by using the intact tiles left in a hallway after the ceiling fell in. Mathematics used as a spell against panic. Morning after morning, people swept glass into polite piles and left them at the curb, tiny monuments to the night. Workers in the factory's war economies turned the night shift into civilization's heartbeat. Women who had braided hair for schoolgirls now braided wiring harnesses by the mile. Men who had sold shoes learned to rivet skins of aluminum until an airplane grew out of the floor, like a modern cathedral. Cafeterias smelled of coffee and hot metal. Bulletin boards spoke in the abstract, quotas, graphs, targets, while the floor spoke in the concrete. Torque, clearance, fit. A foreman tapped a gauge with the lightest fingernail to make the needle honest. A worker slid a photograph under the lip of the machine where only she would see it. The social contract rephrased itself. We will measure our days by what we can build together. The home front learned to count in new currencies. Coupons, points, the number of jars a garden could fill. Shoes were resoled past their vanity. Hemlines traveled in both directions for reasons that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with cloth. Scrap drives assembled pyramids of pots and pans and fence wire and bed frames. Civic sculpture raised to the idea that nothing, properly melted, is ever truly lost. Factory whistles became town clocks. The end of a shift was marked not by sunset, but by siren, by the shared fatigue that feels almost like pride. Soldiers in trenches, forests, ships, and skies. At the edges of all these rooms and workshops, the soldiers carried society's intentions outward, in forests that smelled of damp earth and cordite, in trenches where mud remembered every footstep, in ships that rolled a little even at anchor, in aircraft that turned sky into an experiment in trust. Men and women performed the ritual of watchfulness. They learned to fold fear into the pocket behind duty, to eat when food appeared, to sleep in fractions and call it plenty. They swapped stories about sisters who could outrun any boy, about a tractor that always started on the second try, about a dog that knew the sound of home-baked bread. And those stories did the work of stitching strangers together into a unit. Letters traveled both ways, their sentences straining to make sense across distance and censorship. "I am well," someone wrote, meaning, "I am still here." "The garden is stubborn," came the reply, meaning the world you left continues to be worthy. Photographs yellowed along the folds, where they were taken out and put away again and again. Chaplains of many faiths said the same softly practical things. Medics learned the geography of bodies the way navigators learn coasts. In the pauses between orders, a soldier might notice how dawn makes even barbed wire briefly, absurdly, beautiful. Each barb catching a bead of light like a necklace for a harsh world, the shared weather of a continent, and beyond. By 1942, the war's social climate had a single barometer reading in many languages, pressure falling, then rising, then falling again. The continents were tuned to one another. A bomb fell in Coventry, and a prayer rose in Kansas. A convoy left Halifax, and a light went on in Murmansk. A tank rolled off a line in Michigan, and a crew in Egypt ran a hand along its fresh paint like farmers checking a plow. The world's economies, hearts, anxieties, and hopes beat in a strange, syncopated unison. Coal dust settled into collars in Wales. Wheat bowed in Saskatchewan. A woman in a sari counted ration tokens in Calcutta. A boy in Auckland pinned his father's borrowed cap to a chair and wouldn't let anyone move it. Radio brought the far near. A voice from the BBC blooming in a New York living room. A swing tune skipping across the Atlantic like flat stones. Coded weather reports disguised as domestic observations. People everywhere adjusted their days to fit a larger story. One they had not written, but were nevertheless writing with their conduct. This, then, is the social context. Not merely armies on arrows, but neighborhoods on narrow streets, factories at midnight, ships knitting continents together stitch by dangerous stitch, airfields chalking the sky, and households conserving, adapting, consoling. The war entered through front doors and shop doors and factory gates. It sat down at tables and asked for changes that were both minor and monumental. It made strangers into colleagues and colleagues into companions. It complicated loyalties and clarified values. Above all, it taught millions the same quiet skill: how to continue, carefully, kindly, usefully, when the world insists on being otherwise. And while strategies shifted and borders redrew themselves like shorelines, the human pattern persisted: sweep the glass, share the sugar, write the letter, turn the wrench, hold the hand, keep the list. History moved in large, thunderous bodies. Society moved in countless small motions that added up to endurance. From Warsaw's basements to London's platforms, from Leningrad's kitchens to Cairo's workshops, from Ohio's assembly lines to Okinawa's reefs, people learned to be ballast for one another. That ballast, more than any single plan or speech, kept the world from capsizing while the storm blew on. Stalingrad, when winter learned new words. On the western bank of the Volga, a city that once made tractors became a ledger for the cost of endurance. Stalingrad was not simply a battle. It was a policy of gravity. Streets gained new names. Pavlov's house, the grain elevator, not because signs were changed, but because men refused to move. Rubble became architecture. Cellars became capitals of intent. When winter arrived, it did not choose sides. It stiffened ropes, slowed blood, turned breath into lamps of vapor. Yet the cold favored whoever had learned to live in it longer. The siege devoured certainty, of roads, of timetables, of victory as the natural shape of momentum. Across months that stretched like wire, the Red Army tightened the city into a trap. The German Sixth Army, once the fist of an advance, became the static heart of a defeat. Stalingrad marks a hinge in world memory because it made clear that will, organized over distance and time, could outlast audacity. From this point, the Eastern Front's arrows no longer pointed keenly toward the interior. They began, with a deliberate inevitability, to point back. Freight cars that had once carried the logic of invasion now carried its arithmetic in reverse. Normandy. When the sea became a staircase. 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, entered the language as if they had always belonged there. In June 1944, the Atlantic turned into a vast logistics table. Tides, moonlight, wind, the geometry of steel ramps meeting surf. The first waves were men and their breath. They climbed through water that tried to keep them. They learned sand's unhelpful honesty. It gives way even as you run. Above them, cliffs practiced a hard kind of patience. Behind them, a nation's factories and farms had braided themselves into a single arm, reaching. D-Day is remembered as audacity, and it was. It is also remembered as administration. Bridges of supply slung across the sea. Harbors assembled from prefabricated pieces. The long grammar of organization that turns courage into trajectory. From Normandy forward, the Western Allies did not merely land. They arrived with a future in tow. Fuel, food, spare parts, field hospitals, a plan for the morning after. The operation announced that the war's western edge now possessed both muscle and metabolism. The camps revealed a vocabulary no one wanted. As Allied armies moved, doors opened, wooden, iron, sometimes just the air itself, and the war's most private crimes stepped into daylight. Barbed wire untied its secrets. Barracks breathed out a smell that would not wash from memory. Liberators, many of them scarcely older than the students in Merrick's class, walked among bodies that had been reduced to theories, then to numbers, then to almost nothing, and realized what ideology can do when it convinces itself that people are categories instead of lives. The discovery did not change the military direction of the war. It changed the moral direction of history. Photographs traveled with an authority that no communique could command. Names of places, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Dachau, Buchenwald, became not only coordinates on a map, but alarms in the human imagination. Future treaties, future courts, future doctrines were drafted in the margins of those images. The camps redrew the boundary between war and crime and made the second word impossible to keep quiet again. A political map with new edges and new gravity. When the guns fell silent, the world did not revert. It reassembled. Borders shifted like shorelines after a storm. Some countries reappeared with old names and altered shapes. Others were invented by conference tables and insisted into being by the signatures of tired men. Germany, once the axis around which invasion spun, became a divided sentence, 2 clauses separated by a wire that would one day harden to concrete. Poland's place moved westward like a sliding book on a crowded shelf. Empires that had written themselves across continents suddenly read their own names with doubt. Colonies that had sent men and material began to ask, with calm authority, whether the vocabulary of empire still made sense. Demographics resketched the human landscape. Millions moved, homeward, outward, somewhere, on trains, on foot, with passports issued for the first time or for the last. Displaced persons' camps became temporary cities with their own markets, schools, rumors, romances. The Jewish people, having survived what their persecutors intended to be the end of their story, sought a beginning. In Europe where they stood, in the Americas, in Palestine, where the debate over statehood beat like a drum under diplomacy. The war did not close chapters gently. It tore them out and demanded new ones be written. The Cold War, a temperature you could feel, without touching. Allies of necessity became rivals of doctrine. The vacuum left by a defeated Axis drew in two immense atmospheres, American and Soviet, until the world learned to live under a sky with two weathers. The language of conflict changed from ground taken to influence accrued, from trenches dug to alliances signed. The front line became lines, iron, bamboo, rhetorical, while the arsenal traded tonnage for thresholds. What was possible? What was thinkable? What would end the story for everyone? Berlin offered a distilled version of the era's contradictions. Airlifts as arguments, walls as punctuation, spies as unofficial ambassadors. Korea, later Vietnam, later a litany of proxy stages, demonstrated how the old direct grammar of war had given way to subclauses, to aides memoire, to strategies that denied themselves the clarity of formal declarations. Children practiced duck and cover in schools. Sirens kept their old utility rebranded for a different dread. Yet even within this tense equilibrium, the memory of the recent catastrophe acted as a thermostat. Leaders and citizens alike could imagine the end with such clarity that they often chose policies designed to avoid seeing it. The United Nations, an assembly for preventing silence. Out of the wreckage emerged a building made chiefly of sentences. The United Nations gathered the world's voices, not because agreement was likely, but because disagreement had just proved so costly. The Charter took its nouns seriously: peace, rights, sovereignty, development, and set them on a stage where even small nations could state their lines. It did not guarantee harmony, it institutionalized conversation. Peacekeepers in blue helmets learned a new, awkward choreography: to stand between without belonging to either side, to bear witness in a way that might change what is possible next. Parallel institutions grew. Bretton Woods' financial architecture, the World Bank, the IMF, intended to stabilize the floor beneath politics, to ensure that a bank run in one country would not become a political run everywhere. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights turned lessons from the camps into principles that could be invoked by anyone, anywhere, not as charity, but as claim. These structures were imperfect in the exact ways humans are imperfect. Still, they built a scaffold sturdy enough for better days to climb. Connection to the present ideas that still shape how nations speak to each other. From Stalingrad, we inherit the humbling truth that industrial power and organization can overcome momentum and myth. From Normandy, that coalitions, meticulously planned and supplied, can do together what is impossible alone. From the camps, that the moral perimeter of war must be policed by law, not left to the winner's narrative. Together, these lessons inform today's doctrines: collective defense, proportional response, the protection of civilians, the special vigilance owed to language that turns neighbors into categories, the architecture of post-war life, alliances, trade regimes, courts, rests on a simple conviction that relationships between states should be rule-bound, not appetite-bound. Security guarantees work not merely because of weapons, but because of trust accumulated over years of honest accounting and predictable conduct. Sanctions and tribunals, inspectors and observers, treaties that count warheads and ounces of enriched material. All are descendants of a time when the world learned, in terror, how quickly prosperity and freedom can be misfiled under optional memory as a civic technology. The memorials, museums, days of remembrance, and the slow, careful practice of teaching history are not acts of nostalgia. They are instruments. A photograph behind glass keeps its power not because the glass is clean, but because people walk up to it and let it change them. Names carved into stone refuse the sentence, those people, and insist on this person repeated thousands of times. The act of reading a diary from the Warsaw ghetto, or letters from a Marine in the Pacific, or the testimony of a partisan in the forests, calibrates the moral instruments we use when the present becomes confusing. Memory also disciplines rhetoric. When a politician borrows the words existential threat, the archive quietly asks, by what measure? When a leader promises quick victory, the shelf of slow wars creaks meaningfully. When anyone suggests that a neighbor is less than human, the museum lights brighten a fraction. In this way, remembrance is not passive. It is an alarm system wired to the doors and windows of public life. The ordinary as strategy. World War II teaches that the ordinary is not a luxury added after policy succeeds. It is the ground policy stands on. The capacity to mobilize, to grow food, to build machines, to repair ports, to educate engineers and nurses and translators, proved decisive then and remains decisive now. Supply chains, power grids, public health, schools. These are not background. They are the low, steady music that allows leaders in moments of crisis to speak in a calm key. The war also argues for the dignity of maintenance. A mechanic's wrench, a code clerk's patience, a radio operator's clarity. These unglamorous tools and habits are how societies keep promises under stress. In our time, their counterparts, software patches, vaccine logistics, bridge inspections, content moderation, the unshowy craft of diplomacy, perform the same humble magic of preventing small failures from joining hands and becoming large ones. Warnings, not to frighten, but to guide. The 20th century's worst days warn about the frictionless slide from grievance to grievance, theater to cruelty. They warn about leaders who speak in myths and require enemies to make those myths move. They warn about boredom with institutions, how quickly inefficient deliberation can be replaced by efficient catastrophe. They warn, too, about technological naivete. Radios once, the algorithm now. Tools that can amplify truth or unmoor it, depending on whether citizens are awake to their own responsibilities. Yet the period leaves more than warnings. It leaves templates for repair, airlifts to blockades, corridors for refugees, inspectors in places where trust is too thin to stand unaided, shared research where rivalry might otherwise gobble up advantage, songs, jokes, and the small arts of neighborliness that make plural societies feel less like arguments and more like projects. A quiet synthesis. Stalingrad, Normandy, the open gates. 3 scenes that reorient our compass. The first shows that endurance can wear down even the sharpest advance. The second, that courage scales when logistics do. The third, that victory without conscience is merely a different kind of loss. From these, post-war institutions rose, sometimes creaky, often contested, yet stubbornly useful in lowering the temperature of disputes. The map that followed the war is not the one that preceded it. Neither is the imagination we bring to politics. Power is still real, so are ideals. The best of our current arrangements assume both. That states will pursue interests, and that we can design rooms, councils, courts, assemblies, where those interests are negotiated with words before they are tested with weapons. The distance between those rooms and the trenches is measured in habits, transparency, restraint, the unshowy willingness to be bound by rules one would prefer to redefine. For listeners tonight, far from the sirens and the searchlights, the perspective is not meant to be heavy. It is meant to be steady. The war's turning points teach proportion. Its impacts teach patience. Its memory teaches attention. And so, the line runs from then to now. A teacher counting students and causes. A nurse measuring out courage in teaspoons. A soldier counting cranes and choosing small kindnesses where the script permitted none. The institutions we inherited are, in a sense, their enlarged gestures made permanent. If there is a single instruction the era whispers to the present, it is this: keep the ordinary safe, because from it everything else is built. Guard language, because policy grows in its soil. And remember, calmly, without melodrama, that the worst outcomes are never inevitable so long as people are willing to do the slow work of preventing them. In this way, history's perspective narrows to a practical prayer. May we recognize turning points while there is still time to turn, and may we carry forward the kind of memory that helps us choose the better road. 1944 to 1945. The fall of Berlin. By the winter of 1944, the maps in headquarters had fewer uncertainties and more arrows, thick as rope, pulling toward the center of the German capital. Rail lines carried the insistence of a world converging. Trains of fuel, of food, of men whose eyes had already seen too much. On the ground, the war had become a push of inches and city blocks. Bridges were measured in days, intersections in hours. In the forests, artillery practiced an exhausting theology. Call, response, call again. When spring arrived, it smelled not of blossom, but of brick dust and cordite. Berlin had learned the vocabulary of siege. Cellars reimagined as apartments, stairwells as crossroads, courtyards as arguments. The city's stones, once decorative, took on the practical work of cover. Civilians carried water in buckets that clicked against their calves. Soldiers read orders in the light that slipped through shattered window frames. To the east, the Red Army advanced with a practiced patience born of years of loss, block by block, canal by canal. To the west, Allied armies pressed through towns whose names soldiers would remember as mileposts of fatigue and relief. Aachen, Cologne, the Ruhr. The city became an answer, waiting for a question that everyone already knew. By April, the soundscape was a constant low pressure, artillery like weather, machine gun bursts like arguments that would not resolve. The Reichstag's columns stood cracked, not grand, but stubborn, as if posing for a photograph that would admit no flattery. The final days compressed time. An hour could contain a lifetime of decisions. A minute could empty a street. Flags were hauled up and yanked down in a choreography of exhausted symbolism. Somewhere, a piano, miraculously intact, produced a few notes when a child pressed a key, and the sound startled the room with its honesty. The end, when it came, did not look like victory in a painting. It looked like quiet after too much noise. It looked like soldiers staring at their hands, like a woman tying a white cloth to a broom handle so that language did not have to do the work, like the slow unraveling of an order that had promised eternity and delivered famine, fear, and ash. In the bunkers and rubble, decisions were made that turned slogans into smoke. Above ground, boots shuffled forward to collect the formalities, documents, signatures, custody of buildings that were more memory than function. The city exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in the biological necessity of breath returning when pressure drops. The atomic age begins, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Across the globe, the Pacific still heaved with the stubbornness of distance. Islands had been taken by hand, by yard, by coral ridge, at a cost that blistered the mind. Plans gathered on tables, invasion schedules, casualty estimates that read like nightmares, pretending to be arithmetic. In August 1945, the sky over a Japanese city turned into a new chapter in the human book. A single aircraft, a small set of numbers and names on a flight manifest, and then a light that canceled shadows. Walls borrowed the outlines of bodies. Windows were rewritten as wind. Water rose in a column, and then fell as a rain that did not wash. Hiroshima and then Nagasaki introduced a phrase no one wanted to learn: nuclear threshold. The bomb did in one long second what entire campaigns had failed to do in months. But the aftermath also wrote a second, quieter text: skin remembering heat, survivors searching among ruins that had lost their geometry, doctors improvising new medicine without the vocabulary to name the injuries. The moral calculus would not balance for decades, perhaps never. Debates began at once and have never ended. Yet the political effect was immediate. An emperor's voice on the radio, gentle, formal, acknowledging a shape of defeat that had no precedent. The war's last chapter would close not with a final battle line, but with a new physics: the fate of ordinary people. The grand arrows and the new suns are the headlines. The margins hold the names we've been carrying. Marek, the teacher of Świętojerska Street. By 1944, his school was not a room, but a habit. He taught wherever chalk could find a surface: a shelter wall, the back of a shipping invoice, the inside cover of a ledger rescued from a ruined shop. He had learned to carry lessons in his voice like contraband. In the final months, as Warsaw's story burned toward its own ending, he disappeared for a time. One roundup, one gate closing, one train. And then, abruptly, he reappeared in the ledger of the living, because a neighbor's cousin recognized his face at a work detail and moved a small mountain of favors. After the capitulation in Europe, he returned to the remnants of his street and found, under a tile, the tin of chalk the soldier had once opened and closed. He kept it not as a tool. The chalk had long since turned to powder, but as proof that a room had once been a world. Ruth, the nurse with the watch pinned to her dress, counted nights until counting stopped making sense, then resumed, because that is what order requires. During the spring of 1945, she followed a medical unit into a newly opened camp. She had prepared for wounds. She had not prepared for arithmetic made of bones. She moved as she always had: measure, lift, fold, count. She wiped a brow that might not live to sweat again, and discovered that care does not require hope to proceed. After VE Day, she stood in a London street where people sang and kissed and wept and looked up as if sky were once more a friend. She allowed herself a small dance with a stranger. Then she went on duty, because victory does not cancel pain. It simply changes its source. Months later, she read the news from Japan in a hospital corridor and felt the floor tilt. She steadied herself with a hand against a wall that had held up through so many nights. Hiroshi, the soldier who counted cranes, survived the winter that the new sun remade. He was not in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. He was on a platform at a country station when the word reached his unit. A rumor first, then an order. He expected to feel relief or rage. Instead, he felt empty, as if a sentence had ended without a period. In the days that followed, he unthreaded his uniform from his identity with care, as if taking apart an old kite so the paper could be used again. He returned to a home that had shrunk in his absence, the garden smaller, the radio's voice softer, his mother older in a way that felt like gravity had been unkind. He unfolded the paper crane his sister had made and tried to crease it back into a square. The paper would not forget. He kept the imperfect square anyway. These are 3 among millions. Survivals that look like luck. Losses that look like statistics until you say the names, then the air changes. The resolution, surrenders, and signatures. In May 1945, under lighting too bright for such tired faces, pens scratched at documents in rooms arranged to look like finality. Officers in uniforms that had once commanded fear now seemed like men at the end of a long illness, thinner, quieter, resigned to the logic of their own number columns. Outside, church bells improvised a score for relief, and people who had trained themselves to expect bad news allowed their shoulders to lower by a careful inch. Trains began to carry not battalions, but reunions. In September, aboard a gray ship on a calm bay, another set of signatures pinned a world back to order, at least on paper. Flags hung in careful ranks. The sea did what seas do, lifted and lowered, indifferent to ceremony, but polite enough to keep the deck steady. Photographers caught the moment with the habit of those who know they are stealing from oblivion a fraction of proof. It was over, the paper said. The world, glancing at its own state, replied, almost, homecomings, and the unfamiliar ordinary. The afterward was not a switch. It was a hallway. People moved down it in different ways. Some ran, eager to reach a door that creaked open on the same old room. Some walked, reluctant, unsure what waited. Some paused, because they had no address left to try. The work of peace revealed itself as 1,000 small repairs. Merrick found a space with 4 walls and a roof that did not leak and declared it a school. The first day, 3 children and 1 elderly woman arrived. He set them to reading aloud, because reading is a way to teach breath to be steady. On the second day, there were 5. On the third, 9. He discovered that teaching after catastrophe is not about facts first. It is about restoring the muscle of attention, the willingness to try the next line. He married a librarian who had saved, under her bed, a suitcase of books. Their apartment smelled forever after of paper and tea. Ruth sailed home on a ship built to move men toward danger, but now tasked with returning them to dinners and porches. Cleveland rose out of the lake mist, like a memory deciding to be real. She hugged her mother so carefully it felt like precision work. She found that peacetime has its own fatigue, the effort it takes to explain without injuring, to answer, "How was it?" in a way that neither lies nor floods. She kept the watch pinned to her civilian blouse for months before she admitted it was time to take it off. Eventually, she trained new nurses, and when a siren sounded in the city for reasons that had nothing to do with raids, she felt the old reflex in her bones and then let it pass, like a wave that breaks and returns. Hiroshi planted persimmons. It seemed like a modest argument against entropy. He took work repairing bicycles, the small machinery of motion, gears and chains, and the gentle click of spokes. Every so often he woke imagining the tight, efficient voice of a sergeant. He got up, brewed tea, Watch steam rise, like something forgiving. When Cranes returned to a field near his town, he stood with his hands in his pockets and counted without thinking. He did not arrive at a grand conclusion. He arrived at a practice: greet the birds, fix the chain, write to his sister, deliver a repaired bicycle to a child whose first ride around the block was a declaration of independence too small for newspapers and therefore exactly right. Toward reflection, the fragility of civilization. What does the ending of such a war give back? Streets? Yes. Peace that is more text than texture at first, then slowly becomes routine. A bus that arrives, a shop that opens, a school bell that rings and means only time to learn. But it also leaves a knowledge that does not stay in museums. How thin the membrane is between order and its opposite. How quickly institutions can be bent into shapes they were never meant to take. How easily ambition can recruit grievance, and how stubbornly kindness must work to keep its small territories intact. Standing in the quiet after the signatures, you can hear the architecture of ordinary life settling. Timbers creaking, kettles starting to gossip again, a bicycle bell from 2 blocks over. Civilization is not marble and speeches. It is a distribution of trust across millions of interactions. The bread is safe, the bridge will hold, the letter will arrive, the neighbor will help. During the war, these small contracts were strained. After, they were renegotiated with glances and handshakes and the decision, repeated daily, to honor them. The people who lived through it did not, for the most part, speak in slogans when asked what it meant. They said things like, "We were lucky," or "We managed," or simply, "We're here." From these modest claims, a larger promise can be inferred: to tend the ordinary with unusual care, to watch language for the early signs of fever, to be suspicious of certainties that arrive too quickly and explain too much. And so we move, gently, from the noise to the hush, from boots on broken stone to the soft metronome of a clock in a reopened classroom, from the angry sky to a ward where the loudest sound is the turning of a page, from a soldier's pocket to the patient fold of paper becoming, again and again, the suggestion of a bird. The war's last lessons are not shouted. They are placed in our hands with the same precision Ruth used for gauze, the same care Merrick used for names, the same quiet vow Hiroshi kept for small mercies. The storm has passed. The coastline is changed. We walk it slowly, learning its new curves, and we promise, without trumpet or drum, to keep watch over the fragile structures that let the ordinary live. Victory, for an ordinary person, rarely looks like a parade. It looks like a shop key turning in a lock that hasn't turned in years. It looks like a kettle finally whistling without anyone glancing at the sky. It sounds like a school bell that means only class begins, not seek shelter. Defeat, for an ordinary person, is not maps and speeches. It's the empty chair that never quite stops being set at dinner. It is the letter kept in a drawer you open only when the house is very quiet. Between those two, victory and defeat, most lives occupy a third territory: continuation, the ground that holds when the big words have finished their work and the small verbs sweep, mend, plant, teach, forgive, resume their patient rule. If you ask Merrick what victory means, he points to a shelf of battered books sorted by hands that remember hunger. He would say it is the privilege of unfinished sentences, the chance to live toward tomorrow's lesson plan. If you ask Ruth, she nods toward a ward where the loudest noise is a page turning, and where grief has slowed enough to become care. She would say, Victory is time enough to do the job gently. And if you ask Hiroshi, he gestures at the bicycle he has tuned for a child. He would say, victory is a chain that holds, a wheel that spins true, a safe loop around the block. These are not metaphors to them. They are the texture of days reclaimed. Defeat also has humble shapes. It is the way a name catches in the throat. It is the sudden, inexplicable pause before a date you do not wish to remember aloud. It is a street whose new buildings do not quite align with your memory of where the sun used to hit. Yet even defeat, honestly carried, becomes instruction. Be sparing with certainty. Be generous with attention. Keep a list of what deserves tending when the hour grows strange. The ordinary person is expert in this curriculum. History's noise backdrop fades. The lesson remains. Beyond the arithmetic of battles, there is the long arithmetic of the human heart. Fear subtracted slowly by familiar rituals. Trust accrued through repeated small decencies. Hope compounded by witnesses who refuse to look away. War forces these calculations to the surface. Peace, when it comes, invites them back into daily life, where they do their best work unnoticed. A cup set carefully on a saucer performs a kind of restoration. So does a bus stopping at the curb, a hand raised to help a stranger with a heavy bag, a librarian's voice offering, "You might like this one." There is a reason memory returns us to quiet landscapes when it has the choice. Consider the fields of Normandy now. The grass breathes. Sheep graze with a professional devotion to the present tense. Sunlight moves in wide, forgiving bands across hedgerows that once argued with men and machines about who would pass. If you walk there and pause, wind will comb the meadow into ripples, and skylarks will make their invisible stairways above you. The ground remembers more than it tells. So do we. To stand there is to feel the past as a pressure that is no longer painful, more like the hand of an elder on your shoulder. Wait without push, counsel without command. Berlin, rebuilt, restless, modern, thickens this lesson. Where shells once argued with stone, glass now rehearses the future. Streets that were corridors of hunger and rumor are full of bicycles and the small quarrels of cafe tables. Trees planted after the war have grown tall enough to claim the sky as if it had always been theirs. The city wears its scars as architecture and its atonement as habit. Memorials that insist on specificity, institutions that tolerate dissent, a civic reflex that checks for fever whenever rhetoric runs hot. Out of ruins, a grown-up city. Out of catastrophe, a promise practiced more than proclaimed. And far offshore, the ocean has resumed its old, enormous breathing. Over Midway's archaic coordinates, over the long routes of convoys that once walked the water like nervous caravans, the sea lifts and lowers itself with an untheatrical patience. Waves fold and refold. Salt mists the air with a taste there is no reason to explain. If you listen, you may hear what sailors hear when the engine is idle. A low counsel that predates us and will outlast us. Keep going. Keep balance. Keep rhythm. Keep watch. The great councils of states meet on land, but the ocean's parliament, session after session, never adjourns. What remains when the uniforms are folded away and the banners boxed? Hope remains, but it has changed its clothes. It is less anthem than courtesy. It is the neighbor's knock, the volunteer's clipboard, the quiet audit of our own speech when anger makes language easy. Fear remains because we are human and because history has taught our nervous systems to be alert. But fear, respected without being enthroned, can become a kind of guardian. warning against shortcuts, against the seduction of simple stories that ask us to trade strangers for scapegoats. Memory remains, stubborn and instructive, not as an anchor that refuses movement, but as ballast that keeps the hull steady when wind surprises the sails. The war also gave us a more adult sense of scale. It taught that strength is not only volume and velocity, it is duration and repair. It taught that institutions are worth the boredom they sometimes cause, because boredom inside a courthouse is a cheaper price than drama in a square. It taught that science is a tool with two faces, and that we must choose every day what we want its hands to build. Above all, it taught that the ordinary is not the opposite of greatness. It is the soil from which greatness grows, and the blanket that makes it safe to sleep afterward. Walk a little further along those Norman hedgerows. The path dips. The old stone walls host small, brave flowers whose names most of us never learned. A tractor mumbles a patient hymn in a distant field. Farther along, the sun slips behind a cloud, and the green darkens into something almost blue. In that shift, you can feel history's true mode, not the clang of spectacle, but the long edit from harm to habit, from survival to culture. Somewhere a bell rings the hour. It is exactly on time, which is to say, it carries no drama at all. That is the point. In Berlin, stand for a moment at a crossing where cyclists coast through the green and pedestrians hesitate at the red, each trusting that the others will keep the compact. A tram sighs to a stop. A child presses her palm to the glass and leaves a print that will fade before supper. Underfoot, beneath asphalt, lie layers of stone and story. Yet the city does not spend the day introducing itself as miracle. It simply functions, which is a better boast. Function is the form love takes when it grows up. On the Pacific, sit at the edge of a quiet pier and watch how evening teaches the water to deepen its color. The horizon becomes less a line than a suggestion. A gull argues half-heartedly with no one in particular, and then gives up. You can almost hear the old ships, the old voices, if you let the mind drift. But the ocean asks politely that you return to the present, where the tide will rise this many inches and no more, where the moon minds its path, where the pilings creak in a language older than strategy. This is not amnesia, it is balance. We remember and we proceed. So what do victory and defeat mean for the ordinary person? Perhaps they resolve into the same instruction. Tend what is near. Keep promises that can be kept today. Teach a child to read the next sentence. Fix the hinge. Share the sugar. Watch the words we repeat. They become rooms. Watch the rooms we build. They become cities. Watch the cities. They become the weather of a century. The scale is enormous, but its levers are human-sized. If there is a prayer suitable for the world that emerged from that war, it might sound like this. May our institutions be boring, and our mornings unsurprising. May our arguments be fierce but bounded, and our defeats instructive rather than curdled. May the brave acts we require most often be small ones, yielding a seat, stepping between harshness and its target, writing down the truth even when the audience is only a future reader. May the great machines hum for mending and making, not for breaking. And when we speak of the past, may we be specific in our sorrow and disciplined in our hope. Now, the fields grow dim, and the sheep graze on without consulting us. The city lights of Berlin find their evening logic, windows illuminated like measured breaths. Out at sea, the horizon keeps its lonely appointment with the moon. History does not tuck us in. It hands us the quiet tools, a kettle, a key, a book, a wrench, a pair of steady hands. The war is over. It is never over. It persists as memory, as caution, as the architecture under the paint of our days. Yet tonight, in this calm hour, it recedes enough for us to see what it tried to erase and failed to. The durable kindness of the ordinary, the bravery that doesn't introduce itself, the way grass reclaims an embankment and children reclaim a street, the way the ocean keeps breathing on time. We leave the era gently, not with a door slammed, but with a light switched off room by room, the house settling into its night noises, the soft click of a latch, the faint thrum of pipes, the restful pulse of a neighborhood that has learned and keeps learning how to live together. Tomorrow will ask less of us than those years did, and more than we sometimes imagine. That is all right. We have the tools. We have the names. We have the steady work of peace. The bells that once tolled like metal warnings now speak in gentler vowels. Their notes drift across towns that have remembered the choreography of evening. Shop fronts dimming one by one, windows brightening like polite constellations, door latches offering their soft, domestic click. In Warsaw, a tower clock keeps perfect time. In London, the old faces glow with an unhurried patience. In Berlin, the tram sings its measured line, and no one looks up in fear. The same bronze, the same ropes, the same steeples. Only the meaning has changed. Where alarm once lived, cadence remains. Allow a few quiet measures here, like a low string section breathing. A kettle settling on its trivet. A page turned carefully. Footsteps on stair treads that know the weight of those who came back and those who did not. The mind can hold a simple music, 3 notes, repeated, continue, repair, remember. Between the notes, rest. In those rests, the world collects itself. We return to the fields of Normandy, where sheep graze with professional calm. Wind makes a silver skin on the grass. Hedgerows sketch their old boundaries, now kept for birds instead of battle. Far off, a bell carries across the air, not an order now, but a greeting. If you pause, the ground feels solid underfoot, firm without bravado, generous without spectacle. The earth keeps its promises quietly. In Berlin's evening, glass holds the last of the light. Cyclists drift through crossings. Cafe cups whisper to saucers. A child's laugh slides along the street and vanishes around the corner like a bright thread. The city's memory is not a wound pressed for drama. It is a discipline. Names spoken clearly, places marked with care, argument practiced without rage. Where stone once argued with fire, conversation does the gentler work. At sea, the horizon has resumed its patient duty. Waves rise and lean and set themselves down, an old metronome resuming time after a long cadenza. Over the coordinates that once carried fear, the water breathes in even meters, like a choir humming under words. Ships move as commerce again. Gulls rewrite the margins. If you listen, the ocean keeps counsel in a language older than decision. Keep balance. Keep watch. Let the bells answer one another once more. Distant, then nearer, then far again, stitching town to town with a thread of sound. Between them, silence is not emptiness, but space for gratitude. Space for a teacher at a blackboard, for a nurse's steady palm, for a soldier counting cranes and choosing decency inside a narrow script. Space for the ordinary, which is where history either heals or doesn't. We can leave the era by closing its doors softly, room by room, light by light. The map table, the ward, the depot, the shelter. Each switch makes a small circle of dark that isn't menace, only rest. Outside, the night is ordinary again. A bus sighs, a neighbor waves. Somewhere, a clock resets itself after years of hurried hands and keeps perfect time without being told. Thus, World War II, the greatest storm of the 20th century, recedes into memory. Tonight, we leave its shadows behind, carrying only the quiet lessons of history. Carry them as modest instruments, a list kept accurately, a promise kept on time, a word chosen with care when anger asks for an easier one. Carry them as the bells carry air into sound, without strain, without spectacle, faithfully. And when you hear the hour mark itself on distant metal, let it arrive like a benediction, not a command, not a warning, simply proof that the world endures, and that we, for our part, have chosen to help it do so. The last note fades. The city breathes. The shore accepts the next wave. The fields darken into a kind, usable night. And somewhere, everywhere, the bells go on ringing peacefully.